Shalom, Rabbi Jonathan Ginsburg. This video is about the languages that Jews speak. Of course, you're listening to English. I'm Jewish, so that's a Jewish language. But what is the history of Jewish languages? I think it's fair to say that if God has any language, it'd be Hebrew. After all, the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew. There are a few words from other languages, but predominantly it's a Hebrew book. Now, because the Jewish people were exiled from the land of Israel for 2,000 years, Hebrew was not a spoken language. It was still always the language of our prayer book. Basically, all our prayers are in Hebrew, except for a few in Aramaic. And Jews pray in the vernacular too, like American congregations. Many Jews also have some prayers in English. But following Hebrew, and Hebrew was the language of the Jewish people. All our literature was written in Hebrew basically for the first 2,000 years. But then around 2,000 years ago, the language, the vernacular of the Jews was Aramaic. In fact, the holy book of the Gemara, the tractates which explain the Mishnah as part of the Talmud, are in Aramaic. You can still hear Aramaic spoken among some people, the Kurds, for example, but it's basically for Jews the language of discussion of the Talmud. At the same time, Jews were speaking Greek. In fact, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. That translation is called the Septuagint because there was a time when very few Jews spoke Greek. In fact, Philo basically wrote in Greek. And following that, the Jews spoke in the language of the place where the Jews lived. And for a very long time, Jews spoke Yiddish. That was a language that Jews in Eastern Europe spoke and still speak today. In fact, among very extreme Jews, the Hasidim, Yiddish is often the language of the home. I have relatives in Israel who speak Yiddish to themselves and believe Hebrew is such a holy language because it's the language of the Bible, the language of the prayer book, that even though they live in Israel today, they don't want to speak Hebrew unless it's necessary. But besides that, the Jews in the Sephardic world, or kind of based around Spain, spoke a different language called Ladino. And we have Jews, of course, speaking the language, as I said before, of the country in which they live. So Jews speak many languages because Jews have lived and live today in dozens and dozens of countries. And today, for Jews who want to read our sacred literature, almost everything significant has been translated into English, and so it's widely accessible. Hebrew made a comeback, of course, when the state of Israel was revived in modern times. There was actually a debate about what the language of Israel should be. Not everyone agreed it should be Hebrew because many people thought Hebrew was a dead language like Latin. It could never possibly be the language of a modern country. But a fellow named Ben Yehuda and others argued strenuously for Hebrew being the language of Israel, and today it's become a language. So all kinds of new words had to be created. A lot of them are based on the Bible words, but we have a living language of Hebrew. So what is the language of the Jewish people? Well, ask yourself this. Today, of course, I'm speaking English and Jews are speaking whatever language they're speaking. But if you wanted to guarantee that there's something that you write today, or something that's written, will be read by Jews 1,000 years from now, there's only one language that you could guarantee that it would be understood, and that would be Hebrew. Because that's been the one language since the beginning, and that's the language that the Jewish people have spoken, and we believe God spoke, or in a sense, that wrote the Torah, gave the Torah in Hebrew. Now, Hebrew itself, the letters have undergone significant changes. We have texts in Hebrew which we don't really recognize today as the letters of Hebrew, but the language itself, the words itself, are the words of the Bible. And so Hebrew is, of course, always been the language of the Jews, remains the language of the Jews, and should be. And so it's really incumbent upon Jews to learn Hebrew. We offer many classes in reading Hebrew. There are other courses around the city of Chicago, for example, in speaking Hebrew. The best way to go is to immerse yourself in an old pond, either in Israel or here, to learn Hebrew. But certainly Hebrew is the language of the Jewish people. Now, there is one issue left, which is about prayer. The problem is that even most Jews who come to synagogue regularly don't know Hebrew well enough to be able to read it as quickly as we pray, aren't able to translate the words. So that's a challenge, similar to the challenge the Catholic Church had when they did away with Latin. And so there were experiments done, especially by Reform synagogues, in moving to an all-English prayer service, and mostly English prayer service, based on the origins of Reform in Germany, where they prayed mostly in German. And of course, there are certain prayers that can be said in the vernacular, but that experiment failed. The Jewish people want to speak Hebrew, even though they don't really understand it. They want to pray in Hebrew. And so even in the Reform movement now, their prayer book has half and half Hebrew. The services have more Hebrew in them. And our service, which is conservative, is about 90% in Hebrew. And we have many, many different ways in which people can learn. Of course, if they attend, they learn the words and the music. But Hebrew is, for some reason, in the hearts of the Jews, and we can understand why, the language that they prefer, even if they don't understand it.